And so now it's time for our keynote. Um, David Bowles. David Bowles is an award-winning Mexican-American author and translator from South Texas. Among his many titles are The Smoking Mirror, They Call Me Güero, which was a children's book committee's um, Claudia Lewis Award-winning Best Book for Poetry in 2019, and the upcoming picture book, My Two Border Towns. In 2017, David was inducted into the Texas Institute of Letters. In 2020, he co-founded the activist movement #Dignidad Literaria, which fights to ensure equity for the Latinx community in US publishing. So David, I'll now turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. It's so exciting. What two great panels. It's going to be really interesting to try to follow those up. The great thoughts of my colleagues, my brothers and sisters, my siblings. But what's really neat about talking after those panels is that a lot of what I want to say piggybacks off of what they've said. And so just to help guide me through this talk and to be able to show you some images, I am going to share my screen, so you won't be able to see my lovely face really big, but I'm still over here in the little corner. Um, Today, I want to talk about literary dignity, and this has been on my mind a lot recently. This idea of centering Latinx kids in books and in boardrooms. And there have been some recent things that those of you who are inhabitants of the Twitterverse have noticed about own voices and so forth in recent days. And I kind of want to touch on my general thoughts about where we are, where we're going, and perhaps what's most important for us to focus on as authors and teachers and scholars and activists. So we've all seen the stats, and I don't want to belabor the issue, but it is true that less than 8% of roughly 3,500 books that are published each year for kids are written by authors from the communities of color. And this, of course, contrasts with the fact that 25% of those 3,500 books feature protagonists from those communities of color. So these two statistics kind of sum up the two-pronged problem that we're facing. Arguably, there are more than two prongs to it, but those are the two prongs that are sticking out the furthest and that we have to kind of deal with first, I think. It's hard to decide which of them to address, and we try to do things that address both. But ultimately, there is one of them that is the most destructive and pernicious. And I kind of want to walk you through my thinking, my logic to get to where I am right now. So what's at stake? BIPOC kids, Black, Indigenous, and other kids of color need to see their lives, we all agree, their families, their communities, their culture as cool, important, integrally human, worthy of academic study. And this is something that's really, really important for the teachers in the audience to think about, as valuable and integral parts of not just personal and school life. It's great that you're Mexican American at home and we have the Cinco de Mayo celebration at school. That's not enough, right? Because they need to see their lives also as part of school work, shared public life, broader national conversations. They need to see their communities as mattering at all of those levels, right? Because what happens is if those kids are principally exposed to sort of generic, homogeneous, white American worldview and history, in addition to all the distorted views of their own community that they're receiving through all the different media that they're exposed to, they begin to internalize a view of themselves as unworthy, lesser, marginalized. And frankly, other kids suffer as well. White kids suffer from not being exposed to the multiplicity of cultures that make up the demographics of this country. And seeing themselves as the default always makes them blind to the needs, or blind is a particularly terrible word for me to using, but makes them insensitive and unaware of the needs of these people that have been erased from the national conversation. And as a result, representation becomes important in all these different levels. And what is representation if we take stock in it and try to figure out what we mean? One mistake, and just possibly deliberate, that publishing and some authors have made is to imagine that that hashtag own voices that has, you know, been used over the past few years as a guide to help people find books about children from these communities by people that are from those communities. The notion that that hashtag and people who presume to write an unowned voices book are representing an entire community, and of course that's completely impossible. And it's really depressing that, you know, publishing and some readership expects this of authors. And I think a lot of you on the panels have touched on this in a really cogent way. I mean, personally, I can't tell a story that's universally applicable to every Mexican American, much less every Latinx person. I mean, it's just patently impossible for anybody to do that. But what I can do is draw on my own identity and experience to construct a story about a very specific character or group of characters, and I can put in the work that's required. And this is super, super key. Even for own voices work, it's work at the end of the day, right? Even if these imaginary people come from my own community, it takes work to craft fully realized human beings whose actions and speech and interior lives resonate as real to the readership. And there's a point to doing that, because not only through the cultural specifics, but also through these character level specifics that I'm talking about when you're crafting a book. Readers of any background are going to come away from the book having understood or recognized some universal truth that emerged from that specificity. And to me, that's always my touchstone. How can I write a story that's really, really specific about a particular type of individual? It's tied to my identity, usually in some way, and make it so that any reader who reads it is going to nod their heads and go, yeah, I get it, that has meaning for me as well. I love the fact that on the AWP panel that I was on with Guadalupe Garcia McCall, and Aida Salazar, Guadalupe talked about an Australian adult woman who read her book Under the Mesquite and reached out to her to tell her that the book was transformative for her, that it helped her to deal with her grief in a way that nothing else had. And I mean, you know, Under the Mesquite is about, you know, a teen Chicana living on the border, who, spoiler alert, whose mother dies, right? And the fact that that specificity can resonate universally is so important. It's one of the reasons that writing about, you know, writing anchored stories, anchored in culture and geography, um, it's the way to go, rather than trying to write something that is from the get-go universal in the sense of like vanilla and bland and just every like an every person kind of setting. So what happens, of course, when I write something like that is that readers from my community, the Mexican American, or more broadly the Latinx community, are going to see themselves reflected, but it's not going to be a perfect mirror. And I want to take a little bit of time to talk about mirrors. So Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop never suggested such an impossible thing, that a book can be a perfect mirror of the reader. And I doubt that anybody in the audience thinks this. But it certainly seems that people who are weaponizing the idea of own voices have either accidentally or deliberately misunderstood this point. So it's worth revisiting her words. And you've seen this 1,000 times. And I think that sometimes what happens when we see something as often as we see her words, we don't take a moment to think carefully about what she's saying. If we skip down to where after she talks about, you know, sliding glass doors and windows, she says, I've bolded it, when lighting conditions are just right, however, a window can also be a mirror. Literature transforms human experience and reflects it back to us. And in that reflection, we can see our own lives and experiences as part of the larger human experience. Reading then becomes a means of self-affirmation. So there's a couple of things that I think are really important. You know, we've looked at ourselves in windows. I just a little earlier today was looking out the front door, which has got like a glass um, part to it with like little metal slats, looking out to see whether the mailman had come, because I had like left the little red flag up on my mailbox, and I could see myself and I could see the outside, right? It's like a ghostly image that is reflected in that kind of a mirror. It's not a perfect mirror. We are superimposed upon that outside world, tenuous, temporary. And for some of us, the equivalent of that kind of reflection in literary works is enough. Like I get to see my, floaty, ghostly image imposed upon this world that's not quite my world, but it's similar enough that I can, imagine this ghostly me moving in and out of it somehow. But for other people, that's not satisfying enough. They want a mirror that shows them as they are, solid and whole, like just definitely in this world. Somebody who overlaps so much with their identity that they're almost indistinguishable. But the reality is, and it's hard. It's a hard reality to face for some people, that there's no such thing as a mirror like that. Not even in the real world, right? Even real mirrors, like the one that I was looking at my luxurious locks in this morning, they show us inverted. They flip us right to left, and we're seeing something different than the real world. Only photos get that reflection correct, that orientation and so forth. And frankly, at the end of the day, we have to face facts. Books are not photos of the reader, no matter how much we might want or need them to be. So this brings us to then, if that's true, and we all understand that to be true, and some of you are like maybe rolling your eyes at me, then what is bad rep, right? Well, there are people who have been much more cogent about this than I have, and I will point you at them. Nisi Shaw, Daniel Jose Older, Tempest Bradford, etc. They've pointed out that poor representation, where a person from a particular culture, with all the complexities of that intersectional, very specific identity that I've been hinting at, when they're poorly written, whether the author is from that community or is not from that community, it is typically a failure of either craft or self-knowledge. Like you're either just not doing the work that needs to be done, or you haven't reflected on your own identity enough to be able to write coherently and complexly about the identities of other people. And that's that's why writing the other workshops exist. And Daniel Jose Older's great article, writing the other and the self, is a great starting place as well. Like this notion of, if we're not willing to turn the light of introspection on ourselves and dig deep and figure out who we are and talk about that first, like how can we ever even dare? How could we presume to write about anybody else, right? And this is one of the reasons that journaling and all these other things are just essential parts of preparing yourself to be a writer. But bad rep can also be deliberate, right? It can come out of greed, people jumping on the bandwagon. And it's one of the reasons that when you look at historical numbers of representation in kids lit, and you see a jump between 2014 and the present, like an almost doubling of the percentage of books that have, Latinx protagonists, for example. It's almost entirely, the growth is almost entirely from authors who are not Latinx writing about Latinx characters. So clearly, sometimes bandwagoning, greed, and maybe even outright cruelty in some cases can be the driving force behind somebody doing like a bad job of representing a culture or a particular protagonist. But bad representation, frankly, hurts the way it does because of the baseline lack of equity and literary dignity for our communities, right? If that weren't the case, it would be a different story. There would be a different. I mean, it'd still be painful, but the pain wouldn't be as acute as it is. So, a year ago, January of 2020, as Cynthia said in her introduction to me, Miriam Gurba, Roberto Lovato, and I, we started this activist movement, this hashtag, this kind of loosely knitted group of writers and other types of activists, because we wanted to shift the conversation that was happening at a time away from the particulars of American Dirt and the bad representation that was problematic in that book, for which Miriam and I and Roberto and a bunch of other people were getting like hammered in social media and elsewhere. And we wanted to get Macmillan and other people to look at the real problem. And the real problem is the publishing industry itself. Sure, the author Janine Cummins, was guilty of not doing the work required, right? And that makes her complicit in the problem. But she's not the big bad of the story. She's not the main villain. She's not the person at the end of the video game you have to defeat, right? Flatiron Macmillan, in that particular case, they were the villain. They were the big bad. And more in general, it's big publishing. It's white hegemony's strangle grip on the literary establishment, and that is something that needs to be addressed. I would suggest before we start, berating authors from marginalized and minoritized communities for not always getting things as perfect as we'd like them to do. And we certainly, shouldn't allow agents and editors who aren't from those communities of color to make all kinds of like really bizarre demands about what an own voices book should be. Um, the problem, of course, is that what is needed is really extreme. I mean, think about the millions. Janine Cummins made $3 million before the book would ever hit a shelf because of the advances in the film rights and the translation rights and all the other things that were done. I mean, it was a very lucrative deal. And yes, we live in a capitalist society, and yes, people can make whatever money they want to make. But at the end of the day, um, I mean, that money could have been invested in making Macmillan's List a lot more equitable and more representative of the demographics in the US. And I mean, because big publishing doesn't want to do what has to be done, redistribute resources, retire a bunch of older white editors, recruiting more actively BIPOC editors and authors and so forth, they are, whether deliberately or just by instinct, shifting the responsibility onto the authors. Like, it's y'all who are at fault because you're not doing a good job of representing your communities, that kind of stuff, right? And again, if you're on Twitter, you probably saw this, and it's probably throughout the rest of the social media sphere, but I tend to stay away from everything except Instagram and Twitter. We see own voices being weaponized in multiple ways, forcing basic authors who are queer to basically outing them, or forcing them to come out in public in order to prove that that their books are own voices, because otherwise, they're not going to be published. It's just a really, really ugly inversion of responsibility that's going on. And so I think that is really where we need to start. Equity has got to come first. I mean, if you imagine for a second, if 18% of the US population is Latinx right now, and 25% of school-age children are Latinx, then in an equitable society, roughly 25% of books for kids would be written by Latinx authors. And if that were the case, then the fact that there's a multiplicity of perspectives and that the representation is imperfect and that each of us is writing about the identity that we understand or that that we want to focus on, would be less of a problem, because we wouldn't be having to shoulder the responsibility of representing every damn Latinx in the US, which is completely impossible and is like an ugly thing to ask anybody to do, right? I want to talk just really briefly in the 6 minutes that are left to me about my family, mi familia, because this is the starting point of my own voices writing and beyond. And I think it's important to tip my hat to the people who make the kind of stuff that I do important. And I love the fact that, especially in the last panel, I heard this a lot. Like all the panelists have talked about family and the importance of it. And here are my parents. My dad, who was Mexican American, my mom, who was white. My mom on her side of the family, there was only one cousin, so I spent my entire life with my dad's side of the family. There I am as an angry baby. I guess somebody had just sung to me the lullaby, "Duérmete mi niño, duérmete ya, porque viene el cucú y te comerá." And I was like, oh, so if I don't go to sleep and you tell me the cucuy is going to come and eat me, that's fantastic. It's bitter and angry already as a baby. There's me and my brothers, Fernando and Mateo. Many of you guys come from families that are super complex: divorce, remarriage, step brothers and sisters, half brothers and sisters, all this kind of stuff. That's the way my family is. But it's beautiful that way because it brings in this multiplicity of identities. My brother Fernando is Afro-Mexicano, and I'm a light-skinned Chicano, but my cousins, like you see here, some of my my tios, my Valdemar Marie, and my cousins Victor, Christy, Wade. Um, a more traditional Mexican American, I suppose. And as I moved from my teen years into adulthood, I began to. I had been a great reader, and I loved writing, but school in the 70s and 80s, as several panelists talked about, especially Donna, I remember something that she said, there was this erasure of a Latinx identity, and it wasn't something I really came back to until I was a teenager. And so here you see me playing guitar in my band at age 17. Here I am with my brother Fernando at the beach. And then here I am at the reception after our wedding. Angelica and I got married. We were like both super dirt poor. I was living in the project. She was living in a little trailer. And we got married by a justice of the peace and had a reception in my mom's apartment. And it was, but it was the first step in a journey together that has, brought us to the present. And so here's my family, my two daughters, my son. There I am with my wife up in the top left. My daughter Loba, and my wife there. They've had many drinks at this point. I won't tell you how many. Then here's Fernando, all grown up and working in oil fields. There's my cousin Joseph and his beautiful daughters. There's my fregona wife, just looking badass like always. These are the people whose lives intersect with mine. And when I'm writing the things that I'm writing about, I'm writing for them first and for all the people like them that are here in South Texas on the border that I call my home. And, for me, that's own voices. It's their voices and mine and chorus together. And you see it. I mean, many of you are familiar with my work, I'm assuming. I wanted to write a book that would be kind of like, Percy Jackson, but with Mexican American kids set on the border in this town of Donna, where I'm sitting right now talking to you. And that meant, having kids like my kids who are, middle class Mexican Americans, who, father's an educator, mom's an artist, and they find out they're shapeshifters. That's different from reality. But for the most part, I wanted to paint a world that was like the world that my kids live in. And that means a world that's not completely Mexican American. I mean, this is a community that is, over 90% Mexican American, but we have a very healthy Korean American and Filipino community here. And surrounding towns like in McAllen, we have, robust communities from all over the globe. This is a place that people are drawn to, especially Edinburgh, where the university that I work at is located. So it's a diverse place, and writing about it means writing diversely. The faces on the covers of my books, I always try to make them reflect the diversity in my own family, which ranges from more indigenous to like light-skinned, white-presenting Chicanos to the Afro-Mexicanos and so forth. And that is important to me, to have that represented in my books. So like the covers of my 13th Street books, the interior of my debut picture book, My Two Border Towns, wonderful illustrations by Erika Mesa, who's also a border kid. And all of my books are grounded in this reality, from my retellings early on of folk tales and ghost stories and things like that, to the inevitable for me next step in that, which is digging into the roots of the borderland in Mexico and Mexico's roots in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. And I've spent more than a decade studying Nahuatl and Aztec and Mayan cultures. And, arguably, that is not particularly own voices, but it's important. And it kind of, as Aida talked about when she was discussing the land of the cranes, I mean, it undergirds Mexican American identity, that, the notion that there is a cultural heritage that arises from the larger civilizations in Mesoamerica that existed when the Spanish invaded. And so there's a degree to which this is, my heritage, although there are certainly, I've certainly gotten into debates with indigenous people from Mexico about whether I have the right to retell these stories. And it's a robust and necessary conversation that I don't shy away from. Of course, They Call Me Güero is probably the purest reflection of, my struggles with these issues of identity, that best portrays my identity and the identity of my family and so forth. And as a result, it's done really well for itself. And there will be a sequel coming really, really soon called They Call Her Fregona. So be on the lookout for that. And the the need to retell for an English speaking Latinx audience primarily, but beyond that, these stories that are, again, I argue, the cultural heritage of Mexican Americans, has led me to do things like this graphic novel series, Tales of the Feathered Serpent, or my upcoming, and y'all are the first people to see this cover, and I can imagine Stacey Whitman, if she's watching right now, ready to shoot me an email saying, "What are you doing? Here's the cover for Raul III and my upcoming graphic novel, The Witch Owl Parliament." Um, what can I say to kind of conclude? The work has really only begun. I know we've been fighting for decades, and I know we're spotlighting great authors, and it feels like we're making, that we're making strides ahead. But trust me when I tell you that they are baby steps, and we need to do so much more. And doing that means standing in solidarity and not letting publishing turn us against one another. And so, I mean, I just encourage all of you to think deeply about these things and to put pressure on the gatekeepers. And those of you who are kind of gatekeepers, teachers and librarians in your own communities and school districts, do what you can to use that power to advocate for good representation, for a healthy sense of equity and literary dignity in the collections that you manage, or in your classroom library, and in the books that are used in your curriculum. And I think we'll all be the better for it. Thank you so much. Gracias. Tlazokamati. You guys take care of yourselves. I've got to rush off to the Tucson Book Festival now. Luckily, I don't have to fly there, but it does require closing one tab and opening another. So thank you so much. I really, really appreciate your time. Have a blessed day. This has been fantastic.